Apologies for the slightly late uploading of our slides. So this webinar is focusing on assessment strategy, and it's specifically focusing on resources that are available to help support this that have been developed by the Jisc-funded Viewpoints project. Now, I know that Lee, certainly you were at the workshop last week. We did a face-to-face workshop on these. So Lee, it would be great to have your input at any point if you feel like giving any sort of feedback on how you find using these resources in practice. So what I'll be doing is going through again what what some of the shifting paradigms that there is in terms of assessment practices, and therefore why it might be useful to look at assessment strategy again, and how we can use certain resources to support that. And one of the great things about the resources we're looking at is that they can help to contribute to the sort of sustainability and consistent application of strategy across institutions. So we'll finish up with some examples, a couple of examples of how the principles behind these resources have been used in assessment strategy, taking examples from the University of Strathclyde and the University of Newcastle. So that it gives an overview of what we'll have a look at. The Viewpoints resources themselves. There are two key resources that can be used in terms of strategy development. These resources have been developed for a number of different use cases, including curriculum redesign, but we will look at them specifically here in terms of how they might be used in strategic development. Okay, but what I would like to do is to just start off by seeing how you are, what you're doing, why you're interested in this webinar, and if you could possibly give us some information as to where you're at in terms of developing strategy or engaging with the institutional strategy that your institution has. What I'm just going to do is make sure that we have the mics enabled here so that you can choose to use the mic if you want to. So I'm just going to increase the number of simultaneous speakers so that we can all have a chance to use the mic. So feel free to use the mics or to use the chat window there. And perhaps if we could just go in the order of the participants list at the side. So perhaps Alan Watson, if you'd just like to start off, feel free to use the talk button to come in on the mic, or to just give us a quick introduction to who you are and your interest in assessment strategy.
Hello, thanks for that. Well, my name is Alan Watson. I'm a humble Open University tutor, and I feel that this session is going to help me to get a better understanding of some new aspects of assessment. But I fear that because I am not really involved in strategy formulation, I am very limited in terms of the contribution that I can make. I can't remember exactly the advertisement for this session, but obviously there was something that attracted my attention about it, which is why I signed up for it. But essentially I am just going to be a passenger here to just pick up a little bit more information about assessment, because I'm not convinced that assessment is just always terribly well undertaken in terms of its effectiveness and efficiency. So thanks indeed for this opportunity to learn something. Thank you.
Okay. That's great. Thank you very much, Alan. And Lee, if we could perhaps move on to you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, excellent. I'm not sure because I'm using a very old laptop. I'm Lee Ballantyne, and I work at City of Glasgow College as a learning technologist. I've had an ongoing interest in assessment, mainly in the context of e-assessment, but of course you can't have good e-assessment without good assessment, so I'm always interested in learning more, so that's why I'm here.
Okay, great, thanks very much, Lee. Susan, if you'd like to either use the mic or feel free to use the chat pane. Okay, maybe. Okay, so I'm not hearing anything from Susan. Susan, feel free to. Okay, yep, I can see that you're typing into the chat pane just now, so that's great. We'll wait and have a look to see what you're saying there. And Susanna, can see that you're writing into the chat window as well, so feel free to just do that at the same time. Okay, yep, no problem, Susan. So I know that we have one person from a higher education institution, and the rest of you are from colleges. So we'll hopefully have, well, we will certainly have an opportunity to discuss at the end of this how these resources could be used in different contexts. Okay, so Susan, you're just saying that you're lecturing business studies and you're currently doing your TQFE, and so you're here to learn about new assessment strategies. Okay. And so, okay, so everyone seems to be interested in the e-assessment angle. So, yeah, we are going to be focusing here on more sort of generic principles of good practice around assessment, but these are absolutely valid in offline and online assessment. So, what we can do at the end is make some time to perhaps talk about possibly tools or approaches that could be used in an online context to help support some of these principles of good practice. Okay, and Suzanne, no problem. I'm sorry to hear you've got the cold. So you're e-learning manager at Borders College, recently embedded e-learning into your ICT and teaching and learning strategies, but you haven't done much around e-assessment, and you like to see that element included at a strategic level as well. Yeah, I think that's very true. I think just before I move on, actually, Lee, if you wouldn't mind just switching off your talk button, the reason being that we can sometimes end up getting feedback if there's two. Yeah, that's fabulous, thank you. Okay, so that's great to hear a bit more about you and about your interest, and certainly a lot of interest around the assessment. And I think, Suzanne, your point there as well about not seeing much around the assessment at a strategic level is very true. Certainly in my experience of working with certainly a lot of colleges across Scotland, all the colleges across Scotland, and a number of the higher education institutions, I think assessments can quite often still be treated as something that you just have the sort of the policy level, here are the do's and don'ts type thing of how you approach exams and things like plagiarism and so on. But I think where there has perhaps been lacking across the board is a focus strategically on good assessment practices and how these can actually really support the entire teaching and learning process. So assessment more as a more integrated part of the whole. And I think there has been there have been issues in the past with assessment being seen as a sort of bolt-on, so something that's just bolted onto the end and doesn't necessarily bear a huge amount of relation to the teaching and learning practices that are going on as well. Just say hi to Miles here. Welcome to the session. So Miles, we're just about to move on to the sort of core contact. We have also just gone around the group to see where people's interests are in terms of the webinar and assessment strategy. So feel free just to type that into the chat pane there to give us a sense of where your areas of interest are. Okay, but just to move on to some of the key drivers that are happening around assessment and teaching and learning in general. I think that there's a lot of research and a lot of focus has come through in recent years about the need to involve students as partners in policy and strategic developments. We know that assessment and feedback and poor quality in those areas can have an impact on student retention, so that the national student surveys over recent years have highlighted that things like feedback, for example, have been poor, and that they see this as a key area for improvement. And what, some of the questions that come out of that, is it that the feedback's a problem, or is it the way the students are engaging with the feedback that's a problem? Where is that tension actually lying? Obviously, in terms of current sort of economic drivers, there's a focus on employability at the moment, and also there is this issue that I know many of us are facing, the resource constraints of doing more with less. And so constraints on time and staffing. So there are a number of reasons why looking again at assessment and feedback strategy and practices could be helpful. So what are some of the key issues and barriers in transforming assessment and feedback? I think some of it, again, research over recent years has highlighted the sort of shifting paradigm that there exists for assessment and feedback, and which I think probably quite closely matches the shifts in learning and teaching that have been taking place over the last few years as well. So we have been moving within education from a fully teacher-centred approach to much more of a learner-centred approach. We're aware that assessment of learning, just tacking assessment on the end of a period of learning, is not particularly helpful, that actually integrating more opportunities for diagnostic and formative learning can be really helpful. Diagnostic and formative assessment can be really helpful for the learning process itself. Again, there's also a shift from this concept of the sort of sage on the stage and the experts making judgments to more investigation of supporting students to learn to judge and make their own judgments. That's coming through in things like peer review and students learning the skills to actually make judgments themselves in terms of assessment. There has also been research around moving to more focus on process and outcome rather than just learner outcomes, things like co-construction of criteria, using more collaborative project-based tasks rather than just individual assessment tasks, and perhaps making the assessment more authentic in terms of how we tend to work in employment, where we don't necessarily always work individually. We have to be able to contribute to the development of a team project, and to be able to reflect on our contribution to that, and to close any gaps that are required to get to the required performance level. We are also seeing more opportunities for peer review, for peer interaction, and so feedback coming from multiple sources rather than just the teacher, for example. And I think in terms of, certainly in terms of some of the projects that Jisc has funded in recent assessment and feedback call, there have been projects looking at feedback dialogue or interaction around feedback rather than just feedback as a monologue or just a message from the tutor. It's actually, these projects have been looking at, such as the Interact project, which was based at the University of Dundee, have been looking at that more dialogic feedback process rather than monologic. And from there, also looking at students' response to feedback. So instead of the feedback sort of stopping at the point at which students receive it, continuing that interaction and dialogue to see then what the student is going to do with that feedback. So again, taking that example of the Interact project, they have provided forms, templates for students to state how they are going to, feel they have addressed previous feedback from a previous assessment in the assessment that they're currently undertaking. So they're actually showing what they're doing with the feedback rather than just potentially receiving it and listening to it or reading it, or in very many cases we know that feedback isn't even picked up or read by students at all. So this is moving towards more of a shared responsibility rather than a sense of it just being the responsibility of the teacher to provide feedback. And as I just mentioned, that the use of feedback is an area seen of increasing importance. That we see that something actually happens with the feedback rather than it just being something that is delivered. So there are a number of areas then where assessment feedback practices could be improved and could change. However, we do know that there are some barriers to transformational change across an institution. One of the areas of challenge is around having a shared educational frame of reference for assessment. What is good assessment? What are good assessment practices? And very often academics don't necessarily have the time to be engaging with educational research in that area of assessment. So how do you manage to convey that message without needing to add to the sort of burden of what academics are already doing in their own subject area? And there can be some challenges around disciplinary differences in teaching and learning, and those sort of weak links between local practices, what course teams or what individual members of staff are doing within an institution, and then educational policies and strategies. So it can be that case where you have so many strategies or so many policies to get your head around. How do you actually make sure that the strategy is presented in such a way that all members of staff within an institution can effectively engage with it. And there have also been issues around sort of lack of evidence of benefits. So this is the sort of educational research that is going on currently. There's quite a high level of research into this area, but perhaps some of the evidence of how these changes are impacting is still need to come through. These areas or these barriers that are defined here, if you're interested in those, I would recommend looking at Nicol and Draper, David Nicol and Steve Draper's work in that area. Okay, so what I would quite like to do, just quickly before going on to looking at the Viewpoints resources and to see how these could be used to help address some of those barriers and support that shifting paradigm in terms of assessment and feedback is concerned. But just before we go on to that, if you have any thoughts that you would like to share, again, feel free to take the mic or add it to the chat window around the opportunities and challenges for change in assessment and feedback that you feel would exist in your particular context. You might want to think about how have you agreed curriculum redesign decisions in the past, and how have you ensured that these relate to strategy, or if you don't have, if one of the issues that I know some of you have commented on already is that in fact there perhaps isn't enough strategic leadership in the area of around assessment and feedback. So might want to comment again on that. In terms of the college sector, the mergers that have been happening over the last few years, how have they resulted in changes to how you're approaching the curriculum? For example, are you considering more online learning, flipped classroom, blended learning, and do you see that could have an impact on assessment? And also any thoughts on what opportunities you would see for engaging in curriculum redesign that might align with strategy that exists, or that you would hope might exist in your institution to help lead developments in terms of assessment and feedback in your institution. So I can see Suzanne is typing into the chat pane there, but again, please feel free to take the mic if any of you want to share that at the moment. How do you go about designing and aligning with strategy? Okay, yep, go ahead, Alan.
I found the session so far extremely informative, and there's a lot of food for thought here, and I certainly wouldn't disagree with anything that's been said. I think that all that has been said suggests some very good ideas around, but of course the major challenge, as ever, is in their implementation. I'm not sure that students are as fascinated by assessment as tutors are. I think that many students are so overwhelmed with their lives, their jobs, their workloads in studying, that they really don't have very much interest in the assessment other than an unfortunate necessity that they have to go through. And coupled with this, my experience is that they also fail to benefit from feedback because they do see it as a monologue, as I do, and they are not somehow able to see the benefits and the potential for learning that can be derived from feedback. I remember once upon a time there was a wish to assess students' work alongside them. In other words, it would be synchronous feedback and assessment. I think that's a good idea, but I can see it leading to a lot of very unpleasant arguments which would be totally unhelpful. So I don't think that this is just down to tutors. I think it is also how one engages students to be interested in feedback and see it as being really useful rather than punitive, and how they can maximize learning from that feedback. Those are my personal thoughts based on my own experience. Thanks.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Alan. Thank you. You raised some very interesting points there. What I've just done is put a link in the chat window there to the Interact project, which I mentioned previously, and that is absolutely what you described there about students not necessarily engaging with feedback or not knowing how to engage with it, is essentially what was formed the core challenge that they were trying to address through their project. So I would highly recommend looking at some of the resources they have developed, because they have developed templates and processes by which they can make sure that monologic feedback doesn't happen, and that it is a dialogue around feedback and therefore what they're going to do with it. So they've got templates that help support that, but they also chart out the process and sort of the timeline, if you like, for certain interventions through a program. So they're actually looking at assessment programmatically as well, rather than just assessment for individual units or modules. So yeah, very good points there, and I would recommend to anyone who's sort of interested in that aspect that they have a look at the Interact project. And we'll also go on in the next few slides to look at some of those points as well. Just looking in the chat window, I can see that Suzanne has commented there. So you've commented that the integration of technology enhanced learning requires a huge culture change, and the assessment seems to be another step further from this. If we had tackled e-learning in the assessment as one, it may have been better. Now we need an approach to introduce more e-assessments. Strategic decisions around this would be useful, but there is also a need to showcase good practice to convince lecturers of the value of e-assessment. Addressing this through staff development days is something I'll definitely consider. Great, yep, I absolutely yeah, I agree with your point there that showcasing good practice is useful, and in fact that's a key strategic decision that Edinburgh Napier University have taken in their assessment strategy development. They have, as part of their strategy, very much a part of that, the showcasing of practice from staff across the institution, and it's certainly something that we know is very powerful here at the RSC when we share practice from members of the sector on how they're using technology in education for innovative or excellent practice contexts. And I think it's very powerful when you have a colleague sharing the practicalities and the sort of lessons learned about how they did something and how it worked well for them, how they might do something differently if they were doing it again, and so on. So, yep, very good point. And Susan, you're also saying that staff development days are very helpful for sharing practice and ideas from what has worked with other lecturers. This is something to do a lot at Orkney College. And Alan's saying staff development days, if only. Okay, so, well, what we're going to go on to next is to give you an overview of some resources that you would be able to use in staff development days. But if, as Alan, you seem to be pointing out that you might not have access to those staff development days, these can also be used with that context. So in terms of colleges, I think college staff often struggle to find time, particularly those college staff that are paid purely for contact hours, purely for the sort of teaching. There's very little time left for any kind of course redesign. So that can be challenging then to consider redesign of a course if you're not paid for that time. And obviously in higher education institutions as well, where that might not be such an issue, but there is an issue. There's always issues with workload and with having sort of staff development days or times where people get together to particularly look at assessment and feedback. So we do know, though, from student surveys that students are dissatisfied with assessment feedback processes. So we know something has to be done. And the Viewpoints project, I think, has created some really useful resources which people tend to find really engaging and quite fun to use. So I'll go through what these are. They are based on principles of effective practice that came out of the Re-Engineering Assessment Practices project, which was funded 10 years ago. I was actually involved in it at the University of Strathclyde. It was led by Professor David Nicholl, and they developed a set of principles of practice which essentially synthesized the research into good practice and put them across in terms of principles. The original principle set that David Nicholl developed were actually 7, and he kind of feels that's a bit of a magic number, that you don't want so many principles that people forget them, you don't want so few that they've not got enough meat on them, if you like. However, with the REAP project, they actually ended up with 12 principles, and this was because they added principles for institutional change, if you like, so how to manage these in terms of embedding them across an institution. What the Viewpoints project has done has taken a sort of slightly reduced version of those and come up with 9 principles of effective practice in terms of assessment and feedback. And these are to clarify good performance. We know a lot of the time that students aren't actually even aware of what they're trying to aim for. What is it that they're trying to achieve in terms of the assessment? To encourage time and effort on task, deliver high quality feedback, provide opportunities to act on feedback, as we've just looked at there, that it's those opportunities that can perhaps make the real difference in terms of feedback having an impact. Encourage interaction and dialogue, develop self-assessment and reflection. I think that's an important one in terms of students being able to make their own judgments and becoming more self-regulating or self-directing learners. Give assessment choice, encourage positive motivational beliefs, and use what you learn from students to inform and shape your teaching. Now, these can be more or less challenging depending on your context and what sort of time or what structures you have for making changes in the curriculum. But these principles have then been printed out on cards, and the Viewpoint workshop includes timelines for curriculum design, so course redesign, and timelines also looking at strengths, challenges, opportunities, threats, or impact and frequency of how often these principles are used within a program or within a unit. So the useful thing about these principles is that they can begin to help people to form a common language around assessment and feedback. Because they're just a sort of manageable number of them, people can begin to get used to those, the terminology used, and they again synthesize and sort of summarize the research into good practice in assessment and feedback pooled that has been synthesized by David Nicholl and others. So what teams can do is they can begin to consider what areas, what principles they may not do enough of at all, but they might feel are particularly important, and to consider where they should be really focusing on these, either within a unit context, within a program context, or within an institutional context. So is there an issue with interaction and dialogue, and is that something that you feel could be important, could be enhanced, and and therefore how will you begin to bring that into your institutional practices. So what teams will do is everyone has access to these cards, and then they can agree an objective, which they write at the top of these timelines. These timelines you can write on with the dry white marker pens, and then rub off so that it can be reused. And then everyone has the opportunity to place cards on a timeline of, yeah, we need to do this, we need to make sure we're doing this in an induction point so that everyone knows what we mean by good performance. We've clarified that. We need to know that we're going to build in opportunities for interaction and dialogue, and we need to start that from the start, and we need to make sure that's happening right the way through, or we need to make sure that this is a key point here where we need to ensure that there is time set aside for in providing that dialogue around feedback, so that students have the opportunity to make changes while there's still time, so that that feedback and dialogue isn't happening at the very end of the course when they can't actually use it to make any difference to how they approach subsequent assessments. So what we find that comes out of these sessions, and we've hosted a couple of them at the RSC, but they can also be used and just used within course teams or staff development days and facilitated within an institution. I'll provide a link in a second to where you can download all of these resources. But what they produce are annotated. It gives an overview, an annotated overview of where you think a good practice in terms of assessment feedback could apply in these different contexts. And what tends to happen is that photos are taken of these timelines, and then these can be used and reviewed so that people can see what was decided. It's very much a group task, so it supports that engagement and feeling of ownership, because it's not something that's just come from top down. Everyone feels that they can have a chance to contribute to this. What we've also found is that people who perhaps may not be the most extrovert in terms of contributing or talking in a group setting, they can still influence things by just quietly putting one of the principal cards down and shifting cards around. So it's very much a group agreed process, and we know that that then has positive impact in terms of people engaging if they feel that they've actually been part of it from the start and it's not sort of something imposed onto them. And by taking the photos, these can obviously act as a focus for ongoing and further conversations with teams. So one of the ways that we used these resources at the workshop last week was to review strengths, to look at frequency and impact of use of these resources in the institutional context of the people that were at the workshop. They can also be used to highlight strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. They can also be used and have been successfully used with learners, so that learners can get the principles and help course teams to know where they feel that there are perhaps things missing. So if students feel that they're not getting enough opportunity for interaction and dialogue, then they can provide that feedback in a kind of structured and focused way, They can support, because you can do this quite quickly. I mean, teams can go through these in sort of 20 minutes and get an idea together, so that it's not a hugely onerous or time-consuming process. It doesn't have to be. So just to give you an example of this grid worksheet, this can be used, like I said, for the 4 strengths, challenges, opportunities, threats, or the frequency and impact. With frequency and impact, that sort of middle area there is okay. And what this helps people to do is to just show how frequently they think they use this particular principle and the impact that has. And then you move on to looking at, well, do we want to what could the impact of this principle be if we increased it, and so therefore do we want to do this more frequently, or do we just want to make sure that we do it less frequently actually, but we do it better? So that grid format can help to tease those things out. Okay, so that's just the points there that I've just mentioned. So one of the key things obviously is once you've gained a sense of what you are doing, you can then begin to think about the key principles you would like to improve. And you can either do that by moving these around, taking a new picture of them, or perhaps using post-its to show aspirational locations for what you would like to do with these particular principles. Okay, so from there, that enables people to start developing a plan. When you begin to drill down into the grid timeline, there can be more useful for a sort of strategic, more institutional view. But what these resources also allow is to be used, the same resources essentially, but just a different timeline outline can then be used for curriculum design. So again, there's that link between strategic development and the terminology and the principles used in that strategic development context, but these same principles can be used in a curriculum design context. And for these, it's thinking more about specifics of where do we need to introduce interaction and dialogue, where do we need to clarify good performance, and do we need to improve our induction processes to make sure that we're doing some of these things at the start. And here are just some pictures of people working on these timelines. So we tend to find in all of the workshops that we've delivered with this, the discussion is extremely focused, and these objects sort of serve as kind of social objects that really keeps the discussion on track. What you can also do with the principles cards is turn them over, and they have a range of ideas for how you could use these in practice, and that's in an offline and online context, so e-assessment opportunities there as well. And there are also options for adding your own ideas for how you could implement or embed these principles. So just to sort of sum up, the completed sheet essentially can create a plan, form a plan for change, and be used as a basis for ongoing discussions and reference back to good practice. Okay, I'm conscious that there are a number of questions or comments being made in the chat field, so I'll finish up shortly with these slides and we'll move on to those. Just to sum up some of the benefits that we find with this, that because they're sort of informal, flexible, because it's collaborative, because it promotes real focus, shared problem solving, reflection and debate, these are all really helpful things to get everyone on board with something that can be seen as quite dry and quite separate often with strategy development. The use of the action-based principles as well, because these principles are based on something that you do, they do actually provide that opportunity for then seeing how very immediately and quickly how they can be put into practice. And these are just, I won't spend any time on these, but these are just some feedback and comments that people have made about these. The session is recorded, and if any of you are interested, we can share these slides with you so you can see these. But I want to make sure that we have some time now for addressing some of the comments that have been made. So what I'm just going to do now is post the link to the where these resources are contained, so that's a live link that you can use there. And that those resources include the timeline sheets that you can print off or get sent to printers, and also the cards. Just to give an example of where these principles have been used in practice in actual strategy, assessment strategy, the University of Strathclyde, who hosted the REAP project, implemented the REAP principles in their strategy. So their assessment strategy actually sets out the full set of 12 original REAP principles, and what they also do is provide leaflets for students and staff with the REAP principles sort of contextualized for those two different sets of users, and those again are because the principles are short. They can be used just as reminders and posted on staff notice boards and so on, and give students an idea of the ways that the assessment and feedback are approached at the university. Another example, the University of Newcastle, following a workshop facilitated by Dr. Alan Masson, who led the Viewpoints project for Jisc. They decided that given that they have an overarching graduate attribute vision of leadership, they want graduates of the University of Newcastle to come out and to be leaders. They chose to use a single principle as the sort of core overarching principle that in everything in the university would align to, and I believe that was provide opportunities to act on feedback, so that that was the kind of core key principle for them. And what they do then in terms of their strategy is course teams must develop course designs that show alignment to that particular principle. So they recognize all the principles are important and interlinked. One principle really calls on another, but there's this particular overarching principle that everyone must align to. And so that's quite a sort of straightforward and relatively easy thing to remember, is a single principle that you are trying to align to, and again, that can help with embedding and consistency across an institution in terms of actually embedding the strategy. So here is just again the principles that are used for this, and I think what we'll do is we have 5 minutes left, so we'll just move now on to any further questions and discussion. I'll just go back through the chat pane because I know there have been a lot of comments made, just to see if I can pick up on some of those before we finish. Okay, so Miles is commenting that the mindset and initial workload is difficult to challenge. However, I think the provision of the benefits of feedback via student staff facing data may help the uptake of e-assessments. E.g. feedback provided to students represented higher retention and better overall grades. So I'm not sure I'm picking up quite what you're talking about there. Is it that you feel the sharing of practice can be helpful in sharing how using these principles can impact? Sorry if I've not been able to quite pick that up. Miles, but feel free to provide some clarification on that if you want. Suzanne is saying, I think highlighting the impact on retention and overall success is definitely the key as this idea sells. Is this workshop something which can be facilitated by the RSC? That's a slightly tricky one to answer, Suzanne, because the e-assessment advisor role that I undertake is sadly no longer going to be funded past July of this year. So I'm not entirely sure how e-assessment or assessment support will continue from the RSC. I'd be surprised if there wasn't some support there, but I can't really say at the moment what that will be. So it is something we would have facilitated, but unfortunately there will be less resource for that now, is the short answer to that. Alan has commented, I think the success of a lot of the aspects of this initiative could be influenced by the nature of the relationship between the tutor and tutor, assessor, i.e. many of my courses are exclusively or primarily online. Does this all work better where courses may have many face-to-face elements? No, I wouldn't say so, Alan. I think that the principles are really kind of online, offline, agnostic. Really, they're not specifically to do with being face-to-face at all. And certainly the Interact project, which I posted the link for earlier, they use these principles within that as to inform their project, and they then were looking to develop some of their own principles as well. But certainly they were very influenced by these, and David Nicol, who developed these, the original developer of these principles, was an expert consultant to that project as well. So the opportunities for using these in an online context is very much possible. And Suzanne saying, surely effective feedback is even more important in the online environment. I think possibly, Suzanne, people can feel quite isolated online, and again, going back to the Interact project is I think a good example of where all these things come together. That was actually based around an online postgraduate medical course, which was purely online, purely distant, and also people could do it in their own time. So there weren't cohorts of students. There was very little sense of community on that course essentially. So really they felt that there had to be better communication, there had to be better opportunities for students to feel that there was someone else there and that they could have a dialogue around these aspects. So yep, that was addressed in that project. They looked at that challenge. Okay, now I'm aware we're with some great discussion and comments coming through here, and I'm aware we're at 1:15, so we are due to finish. But I'll just take a few more minutes, and feel free if you have time to stick around, feel free to do so, and I'll just make my way through some more of these. Lee's commenting, you saw someone using screencasting to provide rich feedback online and self and peer assessment is a useful facility to do in an online environment. Yep, screencasting, there are again other resources on the Jisc. If you go to the Jisc assessment and feedback program resources, there are you'll find things on screencasting and audio feedback as well. Thank you, Celeste, for pointing out the Assessment for Learning course that we run. That will be running in May this year. Okay, and Suzanne, you're just commenting on that we don't have time to do this. Yep, that again, I'm going on about the Interact project a lot, but it really did address a lot of these issues. That was something that was also a problem for them, a key concern for them, and that was part of the project, was to make sure that they got staff engagement with it, and so they did very much look at that aspect, and I think that's why they came up with this template idea and quite a strictly structured process that they found didn't add to the burden or certainly where tutors were then spending their time changed, so they weren't spending more time, they were just spending their time slightly differently through the process that they used. So I would highly recommend looking at the templates and processes they used in that project. Okay, and student engagement, again, if you have students involved in strategy development and decisions around assessment, then that does obviously help with their engagement with it. Sparks, the student rep organisation, they are doing a lot of work at the moment on helping students to become, to be involved in decisions, institutional decisions around strategy and design. So well worth checking their website out. I'll just write the name of that organisation in here. Okay. So, and just to finish off, okay, great. Good to hear that you think that these resources might be helpful to you. Suzanne, you had a comment. Where's the best place to find out more about the Viewpoints project? The best contact if you'd like to follow this up more and consider developing the assessment strategy here at the college. So the person who originally developed these has actually moved on from the University of Ulster and is now a senior manager at Blackboard. So I'm not entirely sure how these are being taken forward. But perhaps again just worth dropping the RSC a line, maybe email Fanula and say that this is something that you would like to take forward, and I'm sure that they will look to see if there's some way that the RSC could potentially address that in future, or might be able to give you some links there. And just finally, as we've run out of time, Alan, is age or maturity factor relevant? It said that school age students immediately after leaving job do not absorb and internalise feedback very effectively. I realise that there'll be a spectrum of abilities here. Remember, I work with students who have open access to courses of their choice. That's a good question, Alan. I think that I know certainly that the original motivator for developing these principles on the part of David Nichol, as well as addressing the challenges that had been highlighted around assessment and feedback in student surveys and so on, is very much his focus is on developing self-regulating learners. So aspect of peer review, of involving students in decisions, of having dialogue and so on, is all part of the process he sees of helping students to become more self-directing, self-regulating. So, but he does see that something that has to be managed and facilitated, not something that you can necessarily just assume. So I would highly recommend having a look at the REAP, I'm just going to type that in here, the REAP website, so www.reap.ac.uk, and that also has resources relating to peer review, which might be useful as well. Okay, thanks very much everyone. It's great to have had your active participation today, and yeah, hope to catch up with you soon, and good luck with any developments you do in this area. And if you are developing things, please let us know. We always like to know what people are doing. Okay, thanks everyone. Cheers for now. Bye.